صلوا على محمد وآل محمد. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على خاتم الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين. صلى الله عليه وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين. صلى الله عليك يا رسول الله، صلى الله عليك يا سيدي ويا مولاي يا أبا عبد الله، يا رحمة الله الواسعة ويا باب نجاة الأمة ويا عبرة كل مؤمن ومؤمنة. يا ليتنا فيا ليتنا كنا معكم سيدي فنفوز والله فوزا عظيما. قال تعالى في كتابه الكريم: بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم: ولتكن منكم أمة يدعون إلى الخير ويأمرون بالمعروف وينهون عن المنكر وأولئك هم المفلحون. صدق الله العلي العظيم. صلوا على محمد وآل محمد. Respected elders, brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. The religion of Islam is a holistic tradition. Unlike many religious traditions that limit faith to a private relationship between a person and his or her Lord, Islam is a religion that was meant to dominate both the private and the public sphere. And you find this reflected in Islamic practices. If Islam was meant to be a private affair between you and your Lord, Allah Azza wa Jal would have not legislated Salatul Jama'ah. If religion was private, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would have never legislated a weekly gathering known as Salatul Jumu'ah. If religion was meant to be something private, the adhan would not echo around the world. If religion was meant to be private, we wouldn't have this annual worship where Muslims come together from around the world known as Hajj. What you see is that Islam is not just a private relationship between you and Allah. Islam has a social dimension. And among the social teachings of Islam is the practice of Amr bil Ma'ruf wa Nahy anil Munkar. A common misconception is that if there is wrongdoing and corruption in society, it's not my business. It is your business because Allah made it your business. Because we have a duty not to just establish piety and morality in our homes, but we have a communal duty to ensure that morality is upheld on the societal level. Now, because Islam has established teachings and principles that promote virtue and morality, Muslims, especially young Muslims, have always showed great passion for social change. And hence you find young Muslims from around the world are typically the first to want to join activist movements. If there is a social ill that needs to be addressed, you find that in many cases, it's the Muslim youth who step forward because they understand that Islam was not meant to just reform the individual. Islam was meant to also reform society. But the dilemma that Muslims face is that when you look at society, there are many societal ills. There are many problems that we have in society. And you find that many of these causes, they're looking for representatives. They want people to join their movement. However, a Muslim sometimes is confronted with numerous movements. And some of those movements advocate and promote things that do not align with Islamic values. You see, the problem, my dear brothers and sisters, is that oftentimes there is a disconnect between activists and scholars. There is not enough communication between these two groups. And you find young Muslims, and I don't doubt their intentions, they have the best of intentions, but the problem is sometimes their lack of experience and their lack of knowledge leads them to joining a cause that actually promotes things that are un-Islamic. Now, this is why, my dear brothers and sisters, it is critical that we as Muslims, especially those who want to engage in political activism, who want to engage in and participate in social justice movements, it is imperative that we have an Islamic framework for our activism. You see, brothers and sisters, when you look at the words of Amir al-Mu'mineen, Ali ibn Abi Talib, salawatullahi alayhi, the Imam alayhi salam, he says to Kumail ibn Ziyad, you know, we're familiar with dua Kumail. Kumail ibn Ziyad al-Nakha'i was one of the closest confidants of Amir al-Mu'mineen. What does the Imam say to him? And of course, the advice that he gives to Kumail is advice that applies to all of us. He says, Ya Kumail, ma min harakatin illa wa anta muhtajun fiha ila ma'rifah. The Imam, he says, there is not a single action that you take in life except that you need knowledge and ma'rifah. If you want to join a social movement or a political movement, you have to ensure that the objectives, the language, and the practices of those movements align with divine values and the teachings of Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad. Now, with that said, my dear brothers and sisters, in order to understand activism from an Islamic perspective, so that we can become God-centric activists, we have to first define activism. The word activism is a very popular word. But what is the definition of activism? Because to create and to establish an Islamic framework, we have to define our terms. Now, if you look up the word activism, you'll find the following. You'll find some variation, but the general idea is the following. Activism is a doctrine or a practice that emphasizes direct, vigorous action, especially in support or in opposition to an idea that is controversial in society. The key phrase in the definition of activism is that activism is direct, vigorous action with the intention of influencing society. Now, some Muslims are often tempted to call the Prophet an activist. Sometimes you see, to draw inspiration from the Ma'soomeen, you find sometimes Muslims will say, we need to join this movement because Rasulullah was an activist. Imam al-Sadiq was an activist. However, my dear brothers and sisters, sometimes we have to pause. We have to pause and reflect and understand that sometimes these terms are ideologically loaded. You know, oftentimes activism is closely associated with progressive and liberal values. And we have to be very careful to attribute a label to a ma'soom, especially if it has that type of historical baggage. Now, because an activist is interested in primarily social change, that means we have to be very careful, because Rasulullah was not an activist, because the Prophet was not only interested in social change. Rasulullah was interested in changing something much more deeper, much more deep. The Prophet was interested in spiritual change. It's not just societal change, because you might be able to fix things on a societal level, but there might be spiritual problems that lay beneath the surface. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa is not an activist based on this definition. The Prophet is much deeper, and his objective is much more transcendent than that. The Prophet is seeking to reform hearts and souls. When you reform hearts and souls, naturally you are able to reform society. Now, because activism is defined, and of course you have the word active in it, because activism is defined as direct, vigorous action, that means from an Islamic perspective, assuming that we are addressing an issue that is sanctioned by Islam, we're not promoting something haram or anti-Islamic. Imagine we're dealing with a situation where there is something in society that needs to be changed. Based on the definition of activism, if you look at it from the lens of Amr bil Ma'ruf wa Nahy anil Munkar, you'll gain a better understanding of what Islam says about activism. We have a famous hadith from the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, where the Prophet says, "Man ra'a minkum munkaran falyunkirhu biyadihi." The Prophet says, whoever sees corruption and is able to, they should change it with their hands. Man ra'a minkum munkaran falyunkirhu biyadihi in istata'. If you are able to, try to change the corruptive forces in society through your hands. Now, of course, you need to be in a position of authority to do this. Islam does not promote a culture of, vigilantism, where average citizens are taking, the law into their hand. If you are in a position of authority and you can change that which is corrupt and immoral, then you should do it. And then the Prophet says, فَإِن لَمْ يَسْتَطِعْ فَبِلِسَانِهِ. If the circumstances don't allow you to take that direct, vigorous action, then the next thing that you do is, the second level of Nahy anil Munkar is what? Is to oppose it with your speech. And then the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam says, "La sallu ala Muhammadin wa alihi." I'm not sure if this water is from today or yesterday. فَإِن لَمْ يَسْتَطِعْ فَبِلِسَانِهِ. If you can't change it with action, change it with your speech. فَإِن لَمْ يَسْتَطِعْ فَبِقَلْبِهِ. If you're not able to even change it with your speech, then at least renounce it with your heart. You see, brothers and sisters, when it comes to Amr bil Ma'ruf wa Nahy anil Munkar, there is a certain level that is wajib at all times, in all places. And that is, whenever you see corruption, even if you're not able to change it, even if you can't speak against it, you cannot be neutral. At least at the level of the heart, you have to reject it and denounce it and renounce it. Why? The Prophet says, فَحَسْبُهُ أَن يَعْلَمَ اللَّهُ مِنْ قَلْبِهِ أَنَّهُ لِذَلِكَ كَارِهٌ. Because if you don't want Allah to punish you, then at least show Him that your heart does not accept what is happening. A mu'min cannot be indifferent to that which is haram. You have to take a stand. Now, because the definition, and I want you to listen to this point very, very carefully, because if we don't understand this nuanced point that I'm going to make, you're going to end up canceling a lot of mu'mineen and slandering a lot of mu'mineen. So listen very carefully to what I'm going to say. Because the definition of activism is direct, vigorous action, that means technically, assuming that we're dealing with an issue that Islam wants to eradicate or Islam wants to promote, activism is the first and the second level of Amr bil Ma'ruf and Nahi anil Munkar. Now, what does that mean? That means the highest level of enjoining good and forbidding evil is to take vigorous action. And the lowest level is to renounce with the heart. Now the question here is it my responsibility to determine which level of nahi anil munkar each mu'min needs to show? Is that my job? Or does every person have to assess their own circumstances? I'll give you an example. Because Islam has given us this spectrum, and all of them are sanctioned by the Sharia, that means me as a mu'min, I don't have the right to tell someone, you're not fulfilling your duty of nahi anil munkar. Maybe this mu'min is looking at his circumstances and has decided, I've evaluated my circumstances and I have decided, because I know my situation better than anyone, I can't take rigorous action and I can't speak out, and I will have to limit myself to the lowest level of nahi anil munkar. Why is this important? Because the problem is, many of us, instead of focusing on our own duties, we're trying to police other people and ensure that they are doing nahi anil munkar at the same level as mine. Why is that problematic? I'll give you the following example. You see, imagine you go and it's the time of salah. Now, under normal circumstances, how do you prepare for salah? How do you achieve tahara? You do wudu. If you go and you see a mu'min doing tayammum, and that mu'min, and let's say that you're a nosy person, and you say, why are you doing tayammum? How come you're not doing wudu? And this mu'min says, based on my circumstances, using water is harmful for me. As a mu'min, is it your job to say, I don't believe you, let's go to the doctor? He knows his taklif. It is haram for me to say, oh, no, you should suck it up and do wudu. That's not my duty. So what has happened over the past 10 months, and I've seen it all over social media, how come Fulan hasn't said anything? It's not your business. Maybe this person is in a situation where if they speak, it might create a lot of trouble for them. We don't know people's situation. How come this Maulana hasn't spoken enough? See, it's not enough to speak. You have to speak, and even if you speak, it has to be to the extent that I deem acceptable. Who are you? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us this range, and each mu'min has to decide what they are able to do. I'll give you another example. During the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, you had many great companions, and the Prophet, he praised them, the likes of Abu Dhar and Salman. Is there any Muslim that doubts the piety of Abu Dhar and Salman? No, the Prophet explicitly on numerous occasions has praised them. Now, after the death of the Prophet, there were some problems. For example, if you look at what was happening with the Umayyads were misappropriating funds from Baytul Mal. You have one companion of the Prophet, Abu Dhar al-Ghifari. He goes to Syria and he stands outside of the palace of Muawiyah and he speaks out against the corruption of the Umayyads, against the financial corruption. And then you look at Abu Dhar. Abu Dhar was not as vocal as, you have Salman. Salman was not as vocal as Abu Dhar. Does that mean that Abu Dhar is above Salman? No. Everyone knows their circumstances. We cannot assume that every mu'min is exactly the same. You see, this is very dangerous. Many of us, because we don't know fiqh, we think that whenever there is dhulm, resistance has to look the same for everybody. I'll give you another shocking example. In the year 63 after the Hijrah, this is 2 years after Karbala, Yazid ibn Muawiyah, if you want to look at the resume of Yazid ibn Muawiyah, he comes to power in 61 after Hijrah. In that year, he kills Imam al-Hussein. He orders the killing of Imam al-Hussein. 62 after Hijrah, he catapults the Kaaba. And then 63 after Hijrah, he sends an army under Muslim ibn Uqba, a Syrian army, to invade Medina. Why? Now listen very carefully. Abdullah ibn Hanzala ibn Abi Amr, he is a son of one of the Sahaba, known as Ghasil al-Malaika. He's a prominent tabi'i. When he hears that Hussein was killed by Yazid, he wants to investigate. Who is this new Khalifa that we have? Who is Yazid ibn Muawiyah? So he goes with a group of mu'mineen and they go to Damascus to see who is the new Khalifa. He comes back and he says to the people of Medina that this Khalifa is a fasiq. He's a corrupt person, morally depraved on every level. So he organizes an uprising in Medina, a rebellion. Now the Umayyads, they have zero tolerance for any type of rebellion. Yazid sends he sends Muslim ibn Uqba with his army. Thousands upon thousands. They are stationed outside of Medina and they exchange letters between Muslim ibn Uqba exchanged letters between himself and Abdullah ibn Hanbala that you have 3 days to surrender. If you don't, Yazid says everything in Medina is halal for you to do. The 3 days pass, they don't surrender. This army enters Medina, the city of Rasulullah. They kill 80 Sahaba. Go read about it. Waq'at al-Harra. Go read. 80 Sahaba are killed. 700 memorizers of the Quran are killed. The women of Medina are raped. There is blood flowing in the streets. The Masjid of Rasulullah is defiled. Who's in Medina in 63 after the Hijrah? Imam Zayn al-Abidin. Bloodshed, women are being raped, pregnant women, their wombs are being sliced open and the babies are being taken out. You're talking about brutality that you cannot even imagine. What does Imam Zayn al-Abidin do? Now what do you and I expect? We expect Imam Zayn al-Abidin to come out, draw his sword, or at the very least, condemn the Umayyads. Do you know what the Imam does? Don't take my word for it. Go research it tonight. The Imam doesn't say anything. He leaves the city. In fact, he even writes a letter to Yazid that I have nothing to do with this rebellion. Now some of us, because we have a very simplistic mind, maybe we will cancel Imam Zayn al-Abidin. Why does the Imam do this? Because the Imam knows that if he speaks out, the entire family of the Prophet will be destroyed and no one from Ahlul Bayt would survive. You cannot just rebel without thinking strategically. So what does the Imam do? He does something that would even shock us even more. This shows us that the Imams are very sophisticated in the way that they think. It's not just black and white, and no, they're very careful. Everything that they do is to preserve Islam, not just in the moment, but for future generations. So the Imam alayhi salam, his house becomes a refuge for people who are trying to escape this vicious army. The Imam is sitting at home. So is the Imam doing anything haram? No, because the lowest level of nahi anil munkar is al-inkar al-qalbi. to reject it with your heart. We know at minimum the Imam is doing that. You know who knocks on his door? Marwan ibn al-Hakam. Do you know who Marwan ibn al-Hakam is? He was one of the Umayyads. And because it's a revolution against the Umayyads, he is afraid for his family. Maybe his womenfolk will be taken. Because it's a clash between the Syrian army and the army of Abdullah ibn Hanbala. So he takes his women from door to door. He wants to give them safe refuge. No one gives him safe refuge because you're one of the Umayyads. This Marwan ibn al-Hakam, just to give you an idea of who this is, when he saw the head of Imam al-Hussein on a spear, he says, and this is recorded in the history books, he says, شَفَيْتُ قَلْبِي بِدَمِ الْحُسَيْنِ. He says, my heart is satisfied because I have now seen the blood of Imam al-Hussein. He is the one, when Yazid wanted bay'ah from Imam al-Hussein, he told Walid ibn Utbah, the governor, that do not let Hussein leave your presence without getting bay'ah. If he refuses, chop his head off. In Madinatul Rasul, he was saying that. This vicious man who caused unspeakable pain to the family of the Prophet, he knocks on the door of Imam Zayn al-Abidin. He's one of the oppressors. He comes to Imam Zayn al-Abidin and he says, he has his head down. He cannot even look at Imam Zayn al-Abidin. See, now circumstances have changed. Now Marwan ibn al-Hakam needs Imam Zayn al-Abidin. He says to him, Imam comes to the door. His servant answers the door. Who are you? Marwan. Marwan who? Marwan ibn al-Hakam. Marwan ibn al-Hakam. He comes to the Imam. The Imam rushes to the door. He doesn't even put the sandals on. Quickly. He says, we, the sons of Fatima, we don't like to leave people waiting at our door. He goes to him, Marwan, what do you want? He had his head down. The Imam says, raise your head. Raise your head. What do you need? He says, I'm afraid for my women folk. I'm afraid that they might be raped or killed. Can I keep them with you? Wallah, wallah, wallah. There is no family that is more pure than Ahlul Bayt that could take in someone like this. He says, bring them. He said, in fact, don't keep them in my house in Medina. I have property in Yanbu'. My grandfather, Amir al-Mu'mineen, he developed that land. There is a house far away there. It's safer if your women, your daughters, if they go there. I will send a servant to deliver them food so they don't have to leave the house. This is how Ahlul Bayt treated their women. How did Bani Umayyah treat the women of Ahlul Bayt? The point that I'm trying to make is that resistance doesn't always look the same. Imam Zayn al-Abidin, it might look like he's helping a zalim. You might say, Imam is not speaking out. Who said it is always an obligation to speak out? It's always an obligation to resist oppression. But resistance sometimes is with your hands, sometimes it's with your tongue, and sometimes all you can do is resist it with your heart. Each person has to decide for themselves. So we have to mind our business. Do you know, over the past 10, 11 months, do you know how many mu'mineen have been called CIA agents? How many mu'mineen have been called, agents of Israel? Because, he didn't post anything on social media. Haram. How are you going to face Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with these types of accusations? Maybe this mu'min says, listen, this is all that I can do. It's not my job to dictate what nahi anil munkar looks like from others. Focus on yourself. Now, with that said, in order for our activism to be effective, there are certain things that we have to keep in mind. Number one, as I have already alluded to, you need ilm. If you want to oppose munkar in society, you have to understand what Islam considers to be munkar. Because if you internalize secular liberal values, maybe there is something that Islam says is munkar and you think it is ma'ruf. Your entire moral paradigm is upside down. What is good is decreed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What is corrupt is decided by Allah. Yes, through reason we can figure out certain things, but for most things we need guidance from the Sharia. And this is why the sixth Imam, Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq, salawatullahi alayhi, he says, Sari'u ila talab al-ilm. The Imam says, hasten towards the pursuit of knowledge. فَوَالَّذِي نَفْسِي بِيَدِهِ. The Imam is making a qasam. He says, I swear by Allah, the one who controls my soul. He says, لَحَدِيثٌ وَاحِدٌ فِي حَلَالٍ وَحَرَامٍ تَأْخُذُهُ مِنْ صَادِقٍ خَيْرٌ مِنَ الدُّنْيَا وَمَا حَمَلَتْ مِنْ ذَهَبٍ وَفِضَّةٍ. The Imam says, for you to go and to learn what is halal and what is haram from a truthful person, that activity of seeking knowledge is better than the dunya if it was filled with gold and silver. To seek knowledge. If you want to be an activist, first learn the halal and the haram of Rasulullah and Ahlul Bayt. Otherwise, you're going to be a pawn. You're going to be manipulated. You need to establish that foundation. So this is number one. If you want to be active, you need to know the red lines of the Sharia. Otherwise, you're going to think that you're one of the muslihin, but you're one of the mufsideen without even realizing it. Right. This is number one. Number two, you have to have ikhlas, sincerity. Political, social activism, it's not just about results and impact. It's an action, and just like every action, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ. Actions are not based on results. In Islam, actions are based on intentions. Niyyah, it gives life to your actions. You know, we have a body and we have a soul. What happens when the soul leaves the body? The body is dead. The body is lifeless. When an action does not have a pure niyyah, the action is lifeless. It doesn't have value. Because the only things that have true value, that have enduring value, are those things that are connected to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. مَا عِنْدَكُمْ يَنْفَدْ وَمَا عِنْدَ اللَّهِ بَاقٍ. What is with you, it perishes. But what is with us, what is with me, it remains. That's why, my dear brothers and sisters, sometimes when people get involved in these movements, it becomes more about clout than it does become about sincerity. Right? And this is why Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq alayhi salam, he says, Kullu riya'in shirk. He says, if you do things to garner attention and praise from people, if that is your niyyah, this is a type of shirk. You shouldn't do things to attract the attention and the praise of people. He says, إِنَّهُ مَنْ عَمِلَ لِلنَّاسِ كَانَ ثَوَابُهُ عَلَى النَّاسِ. The Imam says, whoever works for people, meaning you're doing it with the motivation that I want people to praise me, your reward will also be with the people. On the Day of Judgment, don't come to Allah and say, where's my reward? Allah says, no, I gave it to you. You had 300 followers on Instagram. That's enough for you. You had enough attention. وَمَنْ عَمِلَ لِلَّهِ كَانَ ثَوَابُهُ عَلَى اللَّهِ. But if you work for Allah, Allah says, I will compensate you. And is there anyone better to compensate than Allah Azza wa Jal? So this is with respect to sincerity. We said knowledge. If you're an activist, you need knowledge, you need ikhlas, and you also need adab. You need adab. You need akhlaq. Just because you join a movement and you want to change something in society, it doesn't mean you use vulgar language. It doesn't mean you use abusive language. Because when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sends Musa and Harun to go and change society in Egypt, they are to confront the most vicious man, a man who thinks he's God, So what does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say? He says, اذهبا إلى فرعون فقولا له قولا لينا. Speak to Fir'aun. Speak out against what he's doing. But use gentle words. Use lenient words. You don't need to be overly aggressive. You don't need to use obscene language, vulgar language. This is important. Another thing that we have to consider when we engage in any type of activism is that we have to have some self-awareness. Ya akhi, have some self-awareness. Know what your strengths are and know what your weaknesses are. And I've said this before. The problem with many of our communities is that we emphasize so much on leadership training that we need more emphasis on followership training. Not everybody needs to be a leader. This is why, look at the humility of Musa. Musa alayhi salam, Allah gives him a mission. So what does he say? He says, اجعل لي وزيرا من أهلي هارون أخي. He says, appoint from my family a minister, a wazir, Harun, my brother. Why Harun? هو أفصح مني لسانا. Musa says that Harun is more eloquent than I am. There's some self-awareness there. I don't need to be in charge of everything. I don't need to lead every aspect of this movement. I have the humility to recognize that Harun has a strength that I don't have. So I promote him and I step back. This is very important. Self-awareness. And my dear brothers and sisters, finally, the last point that I want to make. When we participate in organized activism, we have to pay attention to our alliances and our associations. You might want to go and advocate for an issue that Islam encourages, but you might go and you might end up underneath a rainbow flag. Now you might think, but I don't support that. Yes, but perception is reality. Perception is reality. If you want to advocate for something in society, you have to make it clear where you stand. You cannot say, why can't we ally with this group and that group? Let me read you the definition of allyship, especially when we speak about LGBTQ allyship. So for example, you might say, this is a cause, but we want to ally with all of these groups. An ally is what? It says an LGBTQ ally is someone who supports, educates themselves about, speaks out, and advocates for LGBTQ people. Are you allowed to advocate for something that's haram? No, I'm not saying that you need to be rude or oppress these people, but we have to be principled. We will come together and we will focus on a particular issue. We will not give the impression that we advocate for something that is against Islam. Because what did Allah do to Qawm Lut? It wasn't just those who are participating in the act. Even the wife of Lut, who was an ally, was punished. You cannot ally with people who are promoting haram if your allyship is interpreted as support. Now some people may say, but Rasulullah, how about Hilf al-Fudul? The Prophet worked with mushrikeen to support the oppressed people in Mecca. Yes, but no one interpreted Rasulullah's participation in Hilf al-Fudul as affirmation and advocacy for idol worship. It was understood that the Prophet is advocating for the oppressed. He is not supporting polytheism and idol worship. Ahlul Bayt, they were very sophisticated in the way that they thought. And this is why when they came to Imam al-Husayn and they asked him for bay'ah, the Imam knew that to give bay'ah to Yazid will send a message to all Muslims that the grandson of the Prophet affirms the leadership of Yazid. And if Imam al-Husayn did, believe me, there would be no Hanafi Muslims, no Shafi'i Muslims, no Maliki Muslims. Islam would be finished. Because Yazid wanted to go back to the days of Jahiliyyah. Islam would be this ancient religion that we read about in the textbooks. But it was the blood of Hussein that kept this religion alive. Imam al-Husayn, he was the line in the sand. that separated batil from haqq. And on this night, we commemorate the light of Imam al-Husayn's heart, the fruit of his heart, the son of Imam al-Husayn alayhi salam, Aliyun al-Akbar. You know, when you listen to these masa'ib, growing up, they're painful. But when you have a son, when you become a father, it takes on a new dimension. You know how precious your children are. You know, before I came to Leicester, my 6-year-old daughter, the entire morning she was crying. And I had to spend hours telling her that inshallah I'm going to come back. And even that was not enough. But Imam al-Husayn, he had to farewell his children knowing he's not going to come back. This is the pain that the grandson of the Prophet endured. When Aliyun al-Akbar, he came to Imam al-Husayn on the day of Ashura. You notice that whenever someone would come to the Imam asking for permission to fight, the Imam would be reluctant. Except with Aliyun al-Akbar. And this shows us that Imam was a great leader, a true leader. Unlike the other leaders of the world, where when there's a battle, they'll send everyone else's sons, but they won't send theirs. Imam, without hesitation, he gives permission to Aliyun al-Akbar because Imam believes in what he's doing. He believes in his mission. Aliyun al-Akbar, he stands in front of Imam al-Husayn. Ya Abata, oh my father, do you give me permission now to enter the battlefield? The narrations say that there was a moment where Imam al-Husayn was just looking at the face of Aliyun al-Akbar. It was as if for that moment, time stood still. And Abu Abdullah is just gazing into the eyes of Aliyun al-Akbar. The narrations say, فَنَظَرَ إِلَيْهِ نَظْرَ آيِسٍ مِّنْ. Imam, he looked at him with eyes of despair. You know when you look at someone and you know that they're not going to be with you for much longer? He looked at him the way that you look at someone who you know is going to leave you very soon. The Imam alayhi salam, he gives him permission. Aliyun al-Akbar is putting on his armor. Imagine a father. This Aliyun al-Akbar, you see him as an adult on the day of Ashura, but he was a child in the lap of Imam al-Husayn. He's looking at him and then he raises his hands in dua. He says, Allahumma ashhad ala ha'ula'i al-qawm faqad baraza ilayhim ghulamun ashbahu an-nas khalqan wa khuluqan wa mantiqan bi rasulika Muhammad. The Imam says, Oh Allah, bear witness over these people, for I am sending a young man to the battlefield who resembles Rasulullah in his appearance, in his conduct and his speech. وَكُنَّا إِذَا اشْتَقْنَا إِلَىٰ رَسُولِكَ. Whenever we would miss Rasulullah, whenever we would yearn for the Messenger of Allah, نَظَرْنَا إِلَىٰ وَجْهِهِ. We would look at the face of Aliyun al-Akbar. He would remind us of the Prophet. Aliyun al-Akbar, he enters the battlefield. He introduces himself. أنا علي بن الحسين بن علي نحن وبيت الله أولى بالنبي لا يحكم فينا ابن الدعي أضربكم بالرمح حتى ينثني أضربكم بالسيف أحمي عن أبي ضرب غلام هاشمي علوي. He enters the battlefield. He fights like a raging lion, but after some time, he comes back to his father. What does he need from his father? The narrations say that he comes back to Aba Abdullah al-Husayn. What does he say? قال أبا الأبا أبا يا أبا العطش قد قتلني. Oh my father, the thirst is killing me. وثقل الحديد أجهدني. And the heavy armor is exhausting me. فهل إلى شربة من الماء سبيل أتقوى بها على الأعداء. Is there a little bit of water that you can give me so I can gain strength and fight the enemies? Imam al-Husayn, he says, oh my son, I don't have any water. I want you to feel how dry my tongue is. The narrations say that the Imam says to Insan, Bunay qatil qalila, just fight a little bit longer. He says, فَمَا أَسْرَعُ أَن تَلْقِي جَدَّكَ مُحَمَّدًا فَيَسْقِيكَ بِكَأْسِهِ الْأَوْفَى لَا تَظْمَأُ بَعْدَهَا أَبَدًا. Oh Ali, oh my beloved son Ali, just fight a little longer. Very soon you will see your grandfather, Rasulullah. He will give you a cup of water. After you drink the water, you will never be thirsty ever again. He goes back into the battlefield. He fights and he fights. But how long can a man fight when he's thirsty? The narrations say that one of the enemy combatants comes and strikes the head of Ali. Rahimallah man nada wa aliya wa sayyida. He falls from his horse and he calls out to his father, Abata. Imagine a father, how much does it hurt you when your child cries to you? Abata. But what does Ali al-Akbar say? He says, Ya Abata alayka minni salam. Peace be to you, O my father. Hada jaddi Rasulullah. You are right, O my father. I can see my grandfather Rasulullah right now giving me a cup of water. Ya Aba Abdullah, Rasulullah is saying to you, Ya Hussein, عجل القدوم إلينا. Hurry up, O Hussein. There is a cup of water waiting for you. Imam al-Hussein, he rushes. Do you know what he does? He rushes to the body of Ali al-Akbar and he does something very heartbreaking. He comes to the mutilated body of his son. The Imam, he places his cheek on the cheek of Ali. And what does he say? He says, عَلَى الدُّنْيَا بَعْدَكَ الْعَفَا. Oh my son Ali, what value does this life have after you? Imam al-Husayn alayhi salam, he was so grief-stricken that he could not carry the body of Ali al-Akbar. He says to Bani Hashim, Ya Bani Hashim, احملوا أخاكم علي إلى الفسطاط. Carry the body of your brother Ali to the tent. They bring his body to the tent. They lay him down into the tent. At that moment, Zainab, the aunt of Ali al-Akbar, she enters the tent. Her beloved nephew, she sees him and she cries out, Wa Aliya, Wa Madluma, Wa Sayyida.
जवानी में मरने की हसरत है किसके